The dust kicked up from the arena floor hung thick in the air under the blazing El Paso sun, mixing with the scent of leather, sweat, and the unmistakable smell of livestock that permeated every corner of the El Paso County Coliseum. The afternoon heat was unforgiving, even in late October, and the concrete walls of the Rodeo arena seemed to radiate warmth like an oven. Nick Varela adjusted his leather gloves for the third time, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he gripped the metal rails of the chute. "You sure about this one, Nick?" called out Jake Morrison, a fellow bull rider from Amarillo who'd been working the circuit for nearly as long as Nick's 28 years. Jake's weathered face showed genuine concern as he nodded toward the massive black bull snorting and pawing in chute number 5. "Devil's Hook ain't like the others. Word is he's already put 3 riders in the hospital this season." Nick spat into the dirt and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The taste of fear was metallic and bitter, but he'd learned long ago not to let it show. In the world of professional bull riding, fear was a luxury no cowboy could afford to display, especially not in front of the other riders, the stock contractors, or the crowd of 3,000 people filling the stands of this Saturday afternoon rodeo. "I've been riding bulls since I was 16, Jake. This Devil's Hook might be mean, but he's still just 8 seconds like any other bull." Nick's voice carried more confidence than he felt. Truth was, he needed this ride more than he'd ever needed anything in his life. His ranking had slipped to 47th in the professional bull riders' standings, and without a strong finish in the remaining events of the season, he'd lose his card and his shot at the PBR World Finals in Las Vegas. The sun beat down mercilessly on the outdoor arena, and Nick could feel sweat beginning to form under his protective vest despite the cooling towels the arena crew had been distributing to riders throughout the day. El Paso in October could still reach into the 90s, and the combination of heat, adrenaline, and raw nerves created a perfect storm of physical and mental pressure. "Riders, we're ready for chute 5, bellowed the arena announcer, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings and bouncing back toward the contestant area behind the chutes. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got Nick Varela from right here in El Paso, Texas, about to take on one of the rankest bulls in professional rodeo, Devil's Hook." The crowd erupted in cheers, particularly from the section where Nick could see his girlfriend Maria and his younger sister Carmen waving a hand-painted sign that read, "Ride Nick." Maria's dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore the lucky blue shirt she'd worn to every one of his rides for the past 2 years. Carmen, fresh out of high school and working at their father's auto repair shop, had driven over from the east side of town despite having to work the late shift that evening. Nick climbed up the side of the chute, his boots finding purchase on the metal rails as he prepared to lower himself onto Devil's Hook's back. The bull was enormous, easily 1,500 pounds of pure muscle and attitude, with a black hide that seemed to absorb the afternoon sunlight and horns that curved wickedly upward like twin daggers. The animal's breathing was deep and rhythmic, but Nick could sense the coiled energy underneath, like a spring wound too tight and ready to explode. "Easy there, big fella," Nick murmured as he settled onto the bull's back, his legs finding their position on either side of the animal's massive ribcage. He could feel Devil's Hook's muscles twitching beneath him, and the bull's head moved from side to side in agitation. The noise from the crowd seemed to fade into background static as Nick focused on the task ahead. Roberto Morales, the Mexican cowboy who'd been Nick's traveling partner for the past 3 seasons, handed Nick his bull rope, the crucial piece of equipment that would be his only connection to the animal beneath him. The rope was made of braided polypropylene with a leather handle, and Nick wrapped it around his right hand in the precise pattern he'd practiced thousands of times since his teenage years. "Remember, hermano," Roberto said, his voice low and steady, "he's got a hard left spin out of the chute, then he'll try to throw you forward over his head. Keep your weight back and ride the spin. You've got this." Nick nodded, pulling his black cowboy hat down tight over his forehead. The protective gear felt familiar and reassuring. The Kevlar vest that would hopefully prevent his ribs from being crushed, the leather chaps that protected his legs from the bull's hide, and the gloves that gave him just enough grip on the rope without reducing his ability to feel the bull's movements. Devil's Hook shifted his weight in the chute, and Nick felt the animal's power transfer through his legs and up into his core. This was the moment that separated professional bull riders from weekend warriors, the instant when 8 seconds could mean the difference between glory and catastrophe, between moving up in the rankings or packing up and heading home. "You ready, Nick?" asked Danny Patterson, the chute boss, his hand resting on the gate latch. Nick took a deep breath, tasting dust and anticipation. In the stands, he could hear Maria screaming his name, and for a moment, he thought about the conversation they'd had that morning over breakfast at Kiki's restaurant on Paisano Street. She'd asked him again when he was going to quit, when he was going to settle down and maybe take over more responsibility at his father's shop. The question hung between them like smoke, unresolved and growing heavier with each passing month. "Let's do this," Nick said, nodding to Danny. The gate swung open, and Devil's Hook exploded out of the chute like a black bolt of lightning. The bull's first move was exactly what Roberto had predicted, a hard left spin that would have unseated a less experienced rider. Nick leaned into the spin, his free arm extended for balance, his riding arm absorbing the shock as Devil's Hook bucked and twisted beneath him. 1 second. 2 seconds. The bull was living up to his reputation, combining raw power with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. Devil's Hook switched directions suddenly, spinning right and throwing his hindquarters high into the air. Nick adjusted, keeping his weight centered, his eyes focused on the bull's neck to anticipate the next move. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. The crowd was on its feet now, sensing they were witnessing something special. Devil's Hook was giving Nick everything he had, but the young cowboy from El Paso was matching him move for move, his body moving in perfect synchronization with the animal's bucking rhythm. 5 seconds. 6 seconds. Nick could feel victory within his grasp, could almost taste the points that would vault him back into contention for a spot in Las Vegas. Devil's Hook gathered himself for one final effort, a move that riders called the elevator, where the bull would launch himself straight up and come down hard, hoping to jar the rider loose. 7 seconds. The bull went vertical, all 4 feet leaving the ground simultaneously. Nick stayed with him, his legs locked around Devil's Hook's massive sides, his right hand maintaining its grip on the bull rope despite the tremendous force trying to tear him loose. Then disaster struck. As Devil's Hook came down from his aerial assault, the bull stumbled slightly, his front legs not quite landing in perfect balance. The stumble threw Nick forward, and for a split second, he found himself off balance and vulnerable. Devil's Hook, sensing the rider's momentary weakness, threw his head back violently and spun left again, but this time with a vicious twist that sent Nick flying through the air toward the metal gates that formed the arena boundary. 8 seconds. The horn sounded just as Nick's body slammed into the gate with a sickening thud that echoed throughout the arena. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent stars exploding across his vision, but worse was yet to come. Devil's Hook, still in a rage from the ride, charged toward the fallen cowboy. Nick tried to roll away, tried to get to his feet, but his body wasn't responding correctly. The bull's massive head caught him in the ribs, lifting him off the ground and throwing him back against the gate a second time. As Nick fell to the dirt, his right hand landed beneath him at an awkward angle. He heard Devil's Hook's hooves thundering toward him again, and he tried desperately to pull his hand away, but the bull was too fast, too close. The impact was devastating. Devil's Hook's front hoof, easily the size of a dinner plate and carrying the weight of 1,500 pounds behind it, came down directly on Nick's right hand. The sound was like kindling snapping in a campfire, followed immediately by Nick's scream of agony that cut through the arena noise like a blade. "Get that bull out of there!" screamed Danny Patterson, and immediately the pickup men on horseback moved in to herd Devil's Hook away from the injured rider. The rodeo clowns, whose job was to distract dangerous bulls, surrounded the animal and guided him toward the exit gate. Nick lay in the dirt, clutching his mangled right hand against his chest, his face pale as the desert sand. Blood seeped through his fingers, and he could see bone fragments protruding from what had once been his knuckles. The pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a white-hot fire that seemed to consume his entire arm. "Nick! Nick!" Maria's voice cut through the haze of pain as she vaulted over the arena fence, her blue shirt becoming dusty as she slid down the rail and ran toward her boyfriend. The arena security tried to stop her, but she pushed past them with the determination of someone whose world was collapsing. The paramedics arrived within seconds, their red emergency bags in hand, as they knelt beside Nick in the dust. The lead paramedic, a woman named Sarah Gutierrez who'd worked rodeos for the past 15 years, took one look at Nick's hand and immediately radioed for a helicopter transport to University Medical Center. "We need to get him to surgery immediately," Sarah told Maria as they loaded Nick onto a backboard. "This is a severe crush injury with multiple fractures. The sooner we get him to a trauma surgeon, the better chance we have of saving function in that hand." As the helicopter lifted off from the parking lot behind the arena, Nick drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine the paramedics had administered creating a strange dreamlike state where the pain seemed to float just beyond his reach. Through the aircraft's window, he could see El Paso spread out below him like a brown and tan patchwork quilt, the Rio Grande snaking its way between Texas and Mexico, dividing two countries but connecting two cultures that had shaped his entire life. The surgery lasted 7 hours. Dr. Michael Chun, the chief orthopedic surgeon at UMC, worked through the night to reconstruct Nick's hand, using titanium plates and screws to rebuild the shattered bones. When Nick finally woke up in the intensive care unit the following morning, his right hand was encased in a cast that extended from his fingertips to his elbow. "The good news is we saved the hand," Dr. Chun explained to Nick and Maria, who had spent the night sleeping in chairs beside his bed. "The bad news is that you've suffered significant damage to the tendons, ligaments, and bones. With extensive physical therapy, you should regain most of the basic function, but, Nick's voice was hoarse from the anesthesia. "But the fine motor control and grip strength you need for bull riding may never fully return. I'm sorry, Nick, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your professional riding career may be over." The words hit Nick like a physical blow, worse than Devil's Hook's hoof had been. Bull riding wasn't just what he did for a living. It was who he was, who he'd been since he was a teenager learning to ride at the practice pens behind his uncle's ranch. The sport had given him purpose, identity, and a future that extended far beyond the blue-collar neighborhoods of East El Paso where he'd grown up. As he stared at the cast covering his right hand, Nick realized that in 8 seconds and one devastating misstep, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of, had been crushed as completely as the bones in his hand. 3 months after the accident, Nick sat in the cramped office of Varela Auto Repair, staring at a computer screen filled with parts orders and customer invoices that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. His right hand, now free from the cast but wrapped in a compression sleeve, ached constantly despite the prescription pain medication Dr. Chun had reluctantly continued to prescribe. The January wind rattled the windows of the shop, and the space heater in the corner struggled against the unusual cold snap that had gripped El Paso for the past week. "Nick, can you grab that wrench set from the top shelf?" called his father, Miguel Varela, from underneath the hood of a 2018 Ford F-150. Miguel had built the auto repair shop from nothing over the past 30 years, working 16-hour days to establish a reputation for honest work and fair prices in a neighborhood where both were sometimes hard to find. Nick stood up from the desk, his movement careful and deliberate. The simple act of reaching overhead sent shooting pains through his hand and up his arm, a constant reminder of that afternoon at the Coliseum. He managed to retrieve the wrench set, but his grip was uncertain, and he nearly dropped the heavy tools twice before getting them safely to his father. "Mijo, maybe you should stick to the paperwork today," Miguel suggested gently, noticing his son's struggle. Miguel's weathered hands, stained permanently with motor oil and scarred from decades of mechanical work, moved with the confidence that Nick's hands had once possessed with a bull rope. The doctor said not to push too hard. Nick nodded reluctantly and returned to the desk, but the numbers on the computer screen blurred together as frustration and anger built in his chest like pressure in a boiler. 6 months ago, he'd been ranked in the top 50 bull riders in the world, traveling to rodeos across the American West, making decent money doing what he loved. Now he couldn't even change the oil in a pickup truck without his hand cramping up and losing strength. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Roberto Morales walked in, stamping snow off his boots and pulling off a heavy winter jacket. Roberto had continued traveling the rodeo circuit, and his appearance was a stark reminder of the life Nick had lost. The Mexican cowboy's face was deeply tanned from outdoor arenas, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone whose body hadn't betrayed him. "Hermano, how are you feeling?" Roberto asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. The two men had been best friends since meeting at a rodeo in Mesquite 5 years earlier, and Roberto had visited regularly during Nick's recovery, bringing news from the circuit and updates on their mutual friends. "Same as yesterday," Nick replied, holding up his injured hand. "Still can't make a fist, still can't grip anything heavier than a coffee cup without it hurting like hell." Roberto nodded sympathetically and pulled up a chair beside the desk. "Listen, Nick, I've been thinking. Maybe this is a sign, you know? Maybe it's time to consider doing something else. You've got your family's business here, Maria loves you, and El Paso ain't going anywhere." The suggestion hit Nick like a slap across the face. "Something else?" "Roberto, I've been riding bulls since I was 16. It's all I know how to do. It's all I've ever wanted to do. I understand that, but... No, you don't understand. Nick's voice rose, causing his father to look up from the truck engine with concern. You're still riding. You're still competing. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything that defines you. Roberto was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. The PBR season starts again in a few weeks. I'll be heading out to Phoenix for the first event. There's still time for you to enter if you think you're ready. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Nick had been following the sport obsessively online, watching videos of rides, studying the standings, feeling increasingly disconnected from the world that had once been his everything. But the thought of actually climbing back on a bull, of wrapping his damaged hand around a bull rope, made his stomach clench with anxiety. I don't know if I'm ready, Nick admitted, the words feeling like defeat even as he spoke them. Only one way to find out, Roberto said. There's a practice session this Saturday at the Calderon Ranch outside of town. Nothing official, just some local guys working with practice bulls. Low-key, no pressure. After Roberto left, Nick found himself staring out the shop window at the traffic moving along Alameda Avenue, watching the ordinary lives of people who had never felt the rush of 8 seconds on the back of a 2,000-pound animal. The normalcy of it all, the commuters heading home from work, the mothers picking up children from school, the elderly couples walking slowly down the sidewalk, seemed foreign and somehow insufficient. That evening, Nick drove to Maria's apartment in his pickup truck, the steering wheel difficult to grip properly with his injured hand. Maria lived in a complex near the University of Texas at El Paso campus, where she was finishing her degree in elementary education. Her apartment was small but carefully decorated, filled with plants, books, and photographs from their 3 years together. How was physical therapy today? Maria asked as she prepared dinner in the tiny kitchen. She'd been unfailingly supportive during his recovery, driving him to appointments, helping with exercises, never complaining about the dramatic change in their circumstances. Painful. Frustrating. The usual. Nick settled onto the couch, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate his hand. Roberto came by the shop today. He suggested I try riding again. Maria paused in her cooking, her back stiffening slightly. They'd had this conversation several times over the past month, and it never ended well. Nick, Dr. Chen said your hand might never be strong enough for professional riding. Why risk making it worse? Because I don't know who I am if I'm not a bull rider, Nick said, the honesty surprising even himself. I look in the mirror, and I don't recognize the person staring back at me. I go to work at the shop, and I feel like I'm pretending to be someone else. Maria turned around, her dark eyes filled with concern and frustration. You're Nick Varela. You're my boyfriend, your father's son, your sister's brother. You're funny and stubborn and brave, sometimes too brave for your own good. You're not just a bull rider. But that's the part of me that mattered, Nick replied. That's the part that made me special. Special? Maria's voice rose slightly. You think you're only special when you're risking your life for 8 seconds on a bull? You think I fell in love with you because you could ride bulls? Nick didn't answer immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. Maria shook her head and returned to cooking, the apartment filling with tense quiet broken only by the sizzling of onions in the pan. The next Saturday morning, Nick drove out to the Calderon Ranch, his heart hammering against his ribs as he turned off the highway onto the dusty ranch road. The ranch was owned by Eduardo Calderon, a former bull rider who'd transitioned into stock contracting after a career-ending injury similar to Nick's. The practice facility was modest compared to professional arenas, but it served its purpose for local cowboys looking to stay sharp during the off-season. Nick arrived to find about a dozen riders milling around the arena, some stretching, others checking their equipment. He recognized most of them. Local cowboys who competed at amateur and semi-professional levels, young men still dreaming of making it to the big leagues. Their easy confidence and casual banter reminded Nick painfully of how he'd felt just months earlier. Nick Varela, called out Tommy Ramirez, a 22-year-old from Las Cruces who'd been trying to break into professional competition for the past 2 years. Man, it's good to see you. How's the hand? Getting better, Nick lied, flexing his fingers inside his glove. The compression sleeve was hidden beneath his shirt, but he could feel its constant reminder of his limitation. Eduardo Calderon approached, his limp barely noticeable after all these years. Eduardo had been thrown into an arena fence in Odessa 15 years earlier, crushing his left leg and ending his riding career. He'd built the practice facility partly as therapy for himself, a way to stay connected to the sport that had defined his youth. "Nick, good to see you out here," Eduardo said, extending his hand for a shake. Nick gripped it as firmly as he could, but Eduardo's experienced eye didn't miss the weakness in his grip. "You sure you're ready for this?" "Only one way to find out," Nick replied, echoing Roberto's words from earlier in the week. The first bull Nick drew was called Easy Money, a relatively gentle animal used primarily for beginners and riders returning from injury. Even so, as Nick settled onto the bull's back in the practice chute, his injured hand trembled as he wrapped the bull rope around his palm. The sensation felt foreign and wrong, like trying to write with his non-dominant hand. "Take your time," Eduardo advised from beside the chute. "No pressure here. Just see how it feels." Nick nodded to the gate man, and Easy Money trotted out of the chute with a few half-hearted bucks. Under normal circumstances, this would have been an embarrassingly easy ride, the kind of bull a professional rider could stay on while barely paying attention. But Nick's balance felt off, his timing was wrong, and after just 4 seconds, he found himself sliding sideways off the bull's back and landing in the arena dirt. The fall itself didn't hurt, but the impact of failure was devastating. Nick lay in the dirt for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was injured, but because he couldn't bear to face the sympathetic looks from the other riders. "Shake it off," Tommy called out. "First one back is always rough." Nick tried 2 more bulls that morning, with similar results. His hand couldn't maintain a secure grip on the bull rope, and without that connection, he had no hope of staying mounted for 8 seconds. By the time he loaded his gear back into his truck, he was covered in dust and humiliation. The drive back to El Paso was the longest 30 minutes of Nick's life. As he pulled into the driveway of his small rental house on the east side of town, he made a decision that felt like admitting defeat. He wouldn't try riding again. That evening, Nick called Roberto to deliver the news. His friend listened quietly as Nick described the disastrous practice session, the weakness in his grip, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the sport that had once been as natural as breathing. "I'm done, Roberto," Nick said finally. "Dr. Chin was right. My riding career is over." "Don't make any permanent decisions based on one bad day," Roberto counseled. "Your hand is still healing. Give it more time." "How much time?" "It's been 3 months. If anything, it's getting worse, not better." Roberto was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Work at the shop, I guess. Try to figure out who I am when I'm not a bull rider." After hanging up, Nick sat in his dark living room, staring at his injured hand in the pale light from the street lamp outside his window. The compression sleeve was tight and uncomfortable, but removing it made the aching worse. He thought about Maria's words about being special for reasons beyond his ability to ride bulls, but the concept felt foreign and unconvincing. 3 days later, Nick made another decision that surprised even himself. He enrolled in night classes at El Paso Community College, beginning work toward a degree in business management. If he was going to spend the rest of his life working at his father's auto shop, he reasoned, he might as well learn how to run it properly. The first night of classes was awkward and intimidating. At 28, Nick was older than most of his classmates, and his hands were more scarred and weathered than those of the recent high school graduates sitting around him. Taking notes was difficult with his injured hand, and he found himself falling behind during lectures. But something unexpected happened during the 3rd week of classes. The instructor, Professor Linda Martinez, assigned a presentation on small business management, and Nick chose to analyze his father's auto repair shop. As he researched the presentation, interviewing his father about the shop's history and operations, Nick began to see the business in a new light. Miguel Varela had built something remarkable from nothing, creating jobs for local workers, providing honest service to working-class families, and establishing a reputation that extended throughout the east side of El Paso. The shop wasn't glamorous like professional bull riding, but it was meaningful in ways that Nick was only beginning to understand. "You know me, Joe," Miguel said one evening as they closed the shop together. "I always hoped you'd take over this business someday. But I wanted it to be your choice, not something forced on you." Nick looked around the shop, at the organized tool sets, the clean workbenches, the customer photos and thank you notes taped to the office wall. And for the first time since the accident, he felt a spark of interest in something other than bull riding. "Maybe it's time I learned more about it," Nick said. Miguel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Maybe it is." As winter slowly gave way to spring in El Paso, Nick threw himself into learning the business with the same intensity he'd once devoted to perfecting his riding technique. He studied automotive technology, took online courses in business management, and spent long hours with his father learning the subtle art of customer service. The work was different from bull riding. Less adrenaline, more patience, focused on solving problems rather than conquering challenges. But gradually, Nick began to find satisfaction in diagnosing a difficult mechanical problem or helping a customer understand a complex repair. His hand continued to improve slowly, and he regained enough function to perform most mechanical tasks, though fine motor control remained elusive. More importantly, the constant ache of loss began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of purpose that had nothing to do with 8-second rides or championship buckles. One evening in early March, as Nick and Maria walked through Chamizal National Memorial Park near the Rio Grande, she asked the question that had been hanging between them for months. "Are you happy?" she said simply. Nick considered the question seriously, watching the sunset paint the Franklin Mountains in shades of orange and purple. "I'm not the same person I was before the accident," he said finally. "But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I was so focused on being special in one specific way that I never considered other possibilities. Maybe there are different kinds of special." Maria smiled and took his hand, the injured one, in hers. Her touch was gentle but firm, and for the first time in months, Nick didn't feel self-conscious about the weakness in his grip. "I've always thought you were special," she said. "Bull riding was just one part of who you are." As they walked back toward the car, Nick realized that recovery wasn't just about healing his hand or regaining his riding ability. It was about discovering who he could become when everything he thought he knew about himself had been taken away. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since Devil's Hook had changed everything, Nick felt like he was moving forward rather than just trying to get back to where he'd been. By late spring, Nick had found a rhythm in his new life that felt almost sustainable. His days began at 6 in the morning at Varela Auto Repair, where he'd arrived early to handle the administrative work before the shop opened. His handwriting was still shaky, but he'd adapted by doing most paperwork on the computer, hunting and pecking at the keyboard with his left hand while his right hand provided uncertain support. The afternoon heat was already building by mid-April, and the shop's ancient air conditioning system struggled against the desert sun. Nick was reviewing a parts order when the bell above the front door chimed, announcing a customer. He looked up to see Jake Morrison, his old traveling partner from the rodeo circuit, standing in the doorway wearing a championship belt buckle and a fresh tan from outdoor arenas. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said, grinning broadly. "Nick Varela, businessman. Never thought I'd see the day." Nick stood up, wiping his hands on a shop rag despite not having touched any machinery. The gesture was automatic, a remnant from years of working with his father during school breaks. "Jake, what brings you to El Paso? Don't tell me you're having truck trouble." "Nah, just passing through on my way to a rodeo in San Antonio. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Jake's eyes swept over the shop, taking in the organized workspace, the customer service awards on the walls, and the overall atmosphere of a well-run small business. "This is nice, Nick. Really nice." "Thanks. It's different from what I expected to be doing, but it's growing on me." Jake nodded politely, but Nick could see something else in his expression. Pity, maybe, or the kind of careful sympathy people reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. "Listen, I've got some news from the circuit. Thought you might want to hear it." They sat down in the small customer waiting area, and Jake pulled out his phone to show Nick a video from the previous weekend's PBR event in Little Rock. The footage showed Roberto Morales riding a bull called Thunder Road, a massive gray animal with a reputation for eliminating top-ranked riders. Roberto made it to 8 seconds and scored 91 points, Jake explained as they watched. Put him in 4th place for the weekend and moved him up to 22nd in the world standings. Nick watched his former partner's flawless technique, the way Roberto's body moved in perfect harmony with the bull's bucking rhythm. It was beautiful and painful at the same time, like watching an old girlfriend dance with someone else. "That's great for Roberto," Nick said, and he meant it. "He deserves a shot at Vegas." "The thing is," Jake continued, "Roberto's been asking about you. A lot of guys have been asking about you, actually. When you're coming back, how your hand is healing, whether you're planning to compete again." "My hand is fine for changing oil and rotating tires," Nick replied. "But it's not fine for bull riding, and it's never going to be." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying Nick's face. "You know, Danny Morrison, my cousin Danny, the one who lost 3 fingers in that ranch accident. He came back and rode for 2 more years. Won the reserve championship at the Fort Worth Stock Show with a prosthetic hand. That's different." Danny lost fingers, but the bones and tendons that were left still worked properly. My hand is like a car with a blown engine. All the parts are there, but they don't work together anymore. Have you thought about riding left-handed? The question caught Nick off guard. In bull riding, the dominant hand typically gripped the bull rope while the free hand was used for balance. Switching hands wasn't unheard of, but it required completely relearning muscle memory that had been developed over years of practice. Left-handed? Jake, I can barely write left-handed, much less ride a bull. I'm just saying it's been done before. If you wanted to try. I don't want to try, Nick interrupted, his voice sharper than he'd intended. I tried, Jake. I went to Eduardo Calderon's place in January and got bucked off 3 practice bulls that my little sister could have ridden. It was humiliating. Jake held up his hands in surrender. Okay. I'm sorry I brought it up. It's just that watching you work here, seeing how miserable you look. Man, you're like a caged animal. This isn't you, Nick. After Jake left, Nick found himself unable to concentrate on work. His father noticed the distraction and suggested Nick take the afternoon off. But instead of going home, Nick drove to Ascaret Park on the southeast side of El Paso. The park was built around a man-made lake that reflected the Franklin Mountains, and Nick often came here when he needed to think. He sat on a picnic table near the water's edge, watching families with young children feed ducks and teenagers playing volleyball on the sandy beach area. The normalcy of it all should have been comforting, but instead it felt suffocating. Jake's words echoed in his mind. This isn't you, Nick. But if this wasn't him, then who was he? And if he wasn't a bull rider anymore, what was he supposed to do with the restless energy that had been building inside him for months? His phone buzzed with a text message from Maria. Dinner at my place tonight? I have news to share. Nick drove to Maria's apartment that evening with a sense of unease that had nothing to do with traffic or the approaching storm clouds gathering over the mountains. When Maria opened the door, her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of look that preceded either very good news or very bad news. Come in and sit down, she said, gesturing toward the couch. I need to tell you something. Nick settled onto the familiar cushions, noting that Maria remained standing. She was wearing her hair loose around her shoulders, and she'd changed from her usual casual clothes into a dress that made her look older and more professional. I got offered a job today, she said without preamble. Teaching position at an elementary school in Austin. It's exactly what I've been working toward for the past 4 years. The words hit Nick like a physical blow. Austin was 300 miles from El Paso, might as well have been on the other side of the world. When would you start? August. Right before the new school year. Maria sat down beside him, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Nick, this is everything I've dreamed of. Small class sizes, great resources, supportive administration. And the salary is twice what I could make here in El Paso. What about us? Maria was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. You could come with me. Austin has great opportunities for business owners. You could start your own shop, or maybe work for one of the big automotive chains while you figure things out. Leave my father's business? Leave my family. People do it all the time, Nick. Young couples move away to build their own lives. It's normal. Nick stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where his truck sat under a streetlight. The bed of the truck still contained his riding gear, ropes, protective vests, boots, equipment that he hadn't touched in months but couldn't bring himself to sell or give away. I can't leave El Paso, he said finally. This is my home. My father's business is here, my family is here. Everything that makes me who I am is here. But who are you, Nick? Maria's voice was gentle but insistent. Because for the past 6 months, you've been going through the motions of a life that doesn't fit you. You're miserable at the shop, you barely sleep, and you spend every weekend watching rodeo videos like you're torturing yourself. I'm adapting, learning new skills, finding new purpose. No, you're hiding. You're afraid to try riding again because you might fail, and you're afraid to leave El Paso because you might discover who you really are without all the familiar landmarks. Nick turned to face her, anger flaring in his chest. So what, you think I should just abandon everything and follow you to Austin? Become your dependent boyfriend who can't even contribute to the household income. I think you should stop being afraid of change. I think you should stop defining yourself by what you can't do and start exploring what you can do. They argued for another hour, their voices raised and emotions raw. Maria accused Nick of using his injury as an excuse to avoid taking risks, while Nick accused her of abandoning their relationship for a career opportunity. Both accusations contained enough truth to be hurtful. When Nick finally left Maria's apartment that night, neither of them knew whether their 3-year relationship had just ended or was simply going through its most serious test. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and sleepless nights. Nick threw himself into the auto shop with renewed intensity, working late into the evening and arriving early in the morning. His father watched with growing concern as Nick pushed himself toward exhaustion, but attempts at conversation were met with monosyllabic responses and subject changes. The breaking point came on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in early May. Nick was working alone in the shop, trying to diagnose an electrical problem in a customer's sedan, when his injured hand cramped suddenly. The socket wrench slipped from his grasp and fell onto the concrete floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty building. Nick stared at the fallen tool for a long moment, then picked it up and hurled it across the shop with his left hand. The wrench struck a pegboard full of tools, sending screwdrivers and pliers clattering to the floor. The noise was tremendous, but it wasn't enough to relieve the pressure building in his chest. He grabbed another tool and threw it, then another. Within minutes, the organized workspace that Miguel Varela had spent decades perfecting was in chaos, with tools scattered across the floor and workbenches overturned. Nick stood in the middle of the destruction, breathing heavily and feeling simultaneously empty and full of rage. "Mijo, what happened here?" Nick turned to see his father standing in the doorway, his weathered face showing more concern than anger despite the chaos surrounding them. "I can't do this," Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't pretend to be someone I'm not. I can't work with tools when my hand doesn't work right. I can't stay in El Paso and watch Maria leave for Austin. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when nothing is fine." Miguel stepped carefully through the scattered tools and put his arms around his son. Nick hadn't cried since the night of the accident, but now the tears came in great heaving sobs that seemed to rise from somewhere deep in his chest. "It's okay, Mijo," Miguel said softly. "It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be scared. But you can't keep carrying all this by yourself." They spent the next 2 hours cleaning up the shop and talking, really talking, for the first time since the accident. Miguel shared stories about his own struggles when he'd first started the business, about nights when he'd questioned whether he was capable of building something meaningful, about times when failure seemed more likely than success. "The thing about building a life," Miguel said as they hung the last of the tools back on their designated hooks, "is that you can't do it by yourself. You need help from people who believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. What if I'm not meant to work with tools? What if I'm not meant to take over the business?" Miguel smiled and put his hand on Nick's shoulder. "Then we'll figure out what you are meant to do. But first, you need to stop running away from the parts of yourself that are injured and start working with the parts that are still strong." That evening, Nick called Roberto for the first time in 2 months. His friend was in Oklahoma City, preparing for a rodeo the following day, but he took the call immediately. "Hermano, I was starting to think you'd forgotten my number. Roberto, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Do you think I could learn to ride left-handed?" Roberto was quiet for so long that Nick wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, his friend's voice came through the speaker, careful and measured. "I think," Roberto said, "that if anyone could do it, it would be you. But Nick, it would mean starting over completely. Everything you know about balance, timing, muscle memory, you'd have to relearn it all. And there's no guarantee it would work. But it's possible. It's possible. Difficult but possible." Nick took a deep breath, staring out his bedroom window at the Franklin Mountains silhouetted against the star-filled desert sky. "I want to try." "When?" "Now. This weekend. Can you help me?" Roberto's laughter was warm and familiar through the phone. "Hermano, I thought you'd never ask." The plan they developed was ambitious and probably foolish. Roberto would meet Nick at the Calderon Ranch the following Saturday, and they would spend the weekend working with practice bulls while Nick attempted to relearn everything he thought he knew about bull riding. They would keep the experiment quiet. No other riders, no spectators, just 2 friends and a collection of relatively gentle animals. When Nick told Maria about his decision, her reaction was not what he'd expected. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Not because you're going back to bull riding, but because you're finally moving forward instead of standing still. Even though it might not work, especially because it might not work. That's what courage looks like, Nick. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to try something despite being afraid." As Nick lay in bed that Friday night, his riding gear laid out and ready for the next morning, he realized that Roberto and Maria were both right about one thing. He had been standing still for months, frozen by the fear of failing again. Tomorrow, for better or worse, he would find out what happened when he stopped being afraid to fall. The Saturday morning sun was just beginning to creep over the Organ Mountains when Nick arrived at the Calderon Ranch, his truck loaded with gear he hadn't touched in 4 months. The air was crisp and cool, unusual for May in the desert, and Nick took it as a good omen as he unloaded his equipment near the practice arena. Roberto was already there, having driven down from his last rodeo in Albuquerque. He was stretching beside his own truck, going through the same pre-riding routine Nick remembered from hundreds of mornings on the road together. The sight was both comforting and surreal, like stepping back into a life that had belonged to someone else. "You sure about this?" Roberto asked as Nick approached, carrying his gear bag and rope. "Because once we start, there's no going back to pretending you're satisfied working on cars for the rest of your life." Nick set down his equipment and began putting on his protective vest, the familiar weight and restriction feeling both foreign and natural after months of regular clothes. "I'm sure I need to know if it's possible. Whether I can actually do it or not, I need to try." Eduardo Calderon emerged from the ranch house carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the same skeptical expression he'd shown during Nick's disastrous attempt in January. "Morning, boys. Nick, I have to ask, you've been thinking about this decision, right? Because getting back on bulls isn't something you do on a whim." "I've been thinking about nothing else for weeks," Nick replied, checking the straps on his vest. "And I know it's a long shot. But Roberto thinks it might be possible to ride left-handed, and I trust his judgment." Eduardo nodded slowly. "Well, I've got some gentle stock you can work with. We'll start with Buttercup. She's about as cooperative as a bull gets. If you can stay on her for 8 seconds, we'll move up to something with a little more attitude." The next hour was devoted to preparation and practice that had nothing to do with bulls. Roberto worked with Nick on the basic mechanics of left-handed riding, helping him understand how the change would affect his balance, timing, and body position. Everything that had been automatic for 12 years of right-handed riding now required conscious thought and deliberate adjustment. "The bull rope goes in your left hand now," Roberto explained, demonstrating the grip with a practice rope. "Your right arm becomes the free arm, but remember it's weaker now, so you'll need to rely more on your core strength for balance." Nick wrapped the rope around his left hand, the braided polypropylene feeling awkward and unfamiliar. His left hand was naturally stronger than his injured right, but it lacked the calluses and muscle memory that came from years of gripping bull ropes. The sensation was like trying to write with his non-dominant hand. Possible, but requiring intense concentration. "This feels completely wrong," Nick admitted as he practiced the grip. "Like I'm playing a game where someone changed all the rules." "That's exactly what you're doing," Roberto said. "But remember, you learned the rules once before. You can learn them again." When they finally approached the chute where Buttercup waited, Nick's heart was pounding harder than it had before any professional ride. The stakes felt enormous, not just 8 seconds on a practice bull, but the possibility of reclaiming a piece of himself that he'd thought was lost forever. Buttercup was aptly named. A small brown cow with gentle eyes and a reputation for steady, predictable bucking, she was the kind of animal used to build confidence in young riders. Under normal circumstances, Nick would have considered her an insult to his abilities. Today, she represented a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. "Take your time," Eduardo advised from beside the chute. "No pressure here. This is about seeing how it feels, not proving anything to anybody." Nick settled onto Buttercup's back, his legs finding their position on either side of her compact frame. The bull rope felt foreign in his left hand, and his balance seemed completely off. Everything his body remembered about riding was reversed, like looking at a familiar photograph in a mirror. "You ready?" Roberto asked from his position near the gate. Nick nodded, not trusting his voice. The gate swung open, and Buttercup trotted out with a few half-hearted bucks that would normally have been laughably easy to ride. But Nick's timing was completely off, his balance uncertain, and after just 3 seconds, he found himself sliding sideways off the bull and landing in the arena dirt. The fall didn't hurt physically, but the emotional impact was devastating. Nick lay in the dust for a moment, staring up at the clear blue desert sky, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake in thinking this could work. "Shake it off," Roberto called out. "First ride is always the hardest. Let's go again." They tried 5 more times that morning, with similar results. Nick's longest ride lasted 4.5 seconds, and that was on a bull so gentle that children had successfully ridden her at ranch rodeos. By lunchtime, Nick was covered in dust, frustrated beyond words, and beginning to wonder if his riding career was truly over. "Let's take a break," Eduardo suggested, and they retreated to the shade of a ramada beside the arena. Roberto handed Nick a bottle of water and studied his friend's dejected expression. "Talk to me, hermano. What's going through your head?" Nick took a long drink of water before answering. "I keep trying to ride the way I used to ride, just with my hands switched. But it's not working. Everything feels wrong, my balance, my timing, even the way I'm thinking about the ride." "That's because you're trying to be the rider you used to be instead of becoming the rider you could be now," Roberto said. "Left-handed riding isn't just right-handed riding with different hands. It's a completely different approach." "What do you mean?" Roberto picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt. "When you rode right-handed, your right side was your strong side. Your right hand controlled the rope, your right leg provided most of your grip, your right arm and shoulder absorbed the impact. Now your left side has to be your strong side, but you're still thinking like a right-handed rider." Eduardo joined the conversation, his experience as both a former rider and stock contractor providing valuable perspective. "Roberto's right. I've seen a few left-handed riders over the years, and the best ones developed a completely different style. More fluid, more reactive, less about dominating the bull, and more about moving with it." "Like dancing instead of fighting?" Nick asked. "Exactly like dancing instead of fighting." They spent the afternoon working on technique without any bulls, focusing on balance, positioning, and the mental approach to left-handed riding. Roberto had Nick practice gripping the rope with his left hand while using his right arm for increasingly complex balance exercises. Gradually, the movements began to feel less foreign, though still far from natural. "The key," Roberto explained, "is to stop trying to control everything with your grip. Left-handed riders rely more on balance, timing, and reading the bull's movements. It's actually a more sophisticated style of riding, but it takes longer to develop." By the time they loaded Buttercup back into the chute for Nick's afternoon attempts, something had shifted in his approach. Instead of trying to dominate the bull through strength and determination, he focused on moving with her rhythm, letting his body respond to her bucking pattern rather than fighting against it. The difference was immediately apparent. Nick's first ride of the afternoon lasted 6 seconds before a loss of concentration caused him to slide off. The second ride went 7 seconds, and on the third attempt, the 8-second horn sounded just as Nick was beginning to feel truly balanced and confident. "That's it," Roberto shouted, running into the arena to help Nick to his feet. "That's what left-handed riding looks like." Eduardo was grinning as he approached. "Now that looked like a bull rider. Different than you used to be, but definitely a bull rider." The success was intoxicating, but Nick forced himself to remain realistic. "One ride on Buttercup doesn't mean I'm ready for professional competition." "No," Eduardo agreed, "but it means you're ready for the next step. Tomorrow we'll try you on something with a little more attitude." That evening, Nick drove back to El Paso with a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in months. The physical soreness from falling off bulls was familiar and almost comforting, a reminder of who he used to be and who he might become again. When he stopped at Maria's apartment to share the news, he found her grading papers at her kitchen table. "How did it go?" she asked, looking up from a stack of student essays. "Better than I expected, but not as easy as I hoped," Nick replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I stayed on for 8 seconds once, but it was on a bull that probably couldn't buck off a scarecrow." Maria smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "But you stayed on." "I stayed on. Nick, I need to tell you something." Maria set down her red pen and looked directly at him. "I've been thinking about Austin, about the job offer, about us." Nick felt his stomach clench, preparing for bad news. "I want you to know that whatever happens with your riding, whatever you decide to do with your life, I love you. Not the bull rider version of you, not the mechanic version of you, just you. The stubborn, brave, sometimes infuriating man I fell in love with 3 years ago." "What does that mean for Austin?" "It means I'm going to turn down the job." Nick stared at her in shock. "Maria, you can't do that. This is your dream job, everything you've worked for." "My dream job is teaching children. I can do that in El Paso, even if the pay isn't as good and the resources aren't as extensive. But I can't do it without the man I love, and I can't ask you to abandon your family and your roots for my career." "But," "Nick, let me finish. I'm turning down Austin, but I need something from you in return. I need you to stop living in the past. Whether you become a bull rider again or not, whether you take over your father's business or start something completely new, I need you to start moving forward instead of looking backward. Nick reached across the table and took her hand, the uninjured one, in both of his. I think today was the first step forward I've taken since the accident. Good. Because I've waited 6 months for you to take a step in any direction. They spent the evening making plans for the immediate future. Nick would continue working with Roberto and Eduardo, gradually progressing to more challenging bulls as his left-handed technique improved. Maria would look for teaching positions in the El Paso area while finishing her degree. Most importantly, they would both stop making major life decisions based on fear. The following Saturday brought a new challenge. A bull named Tumbleweed who had a reputation for testing young riders without injuring them. Unlike Buttercup, Tumbleweed was genuinely athletic, with a spinning jump out of the chute and a tendency to change directions without warning. This is where we find out if you're really ready to be a bull rider again, Eduardo warned as Nick prepared his equipment. Tumbleweed will expose any weaknesses in your technique. Nick settled onto the bull's back with greater confidence than he'd felt the previous week, but also with a healthy respect for the increased difficulty. Tumbleweed was a real bull, not a practice animal, and riding him successfully would represent a genuine accomplishment. The gate opened, and Tumbleweed exploded out of the chute with a spinning jump that would have unseated the previous week's version of Nick immediately. But the hours of practice had improved his balance and timing, and he managed to stay centered as the bull spun left, then right, then launched into a series of high kicks that tested every muscle in his core. 5 seconds. 6 seconds. Nick could feel himself getting tired, his left-handed grip beginning to weaken, but he was still in control. Tumbleweed gathered himself for one final effort, a move that combined a high jump with a sharp turn that was designed to catch riders off guard. 7 seconds. 8 seconds. The horn sounded just as Nick was beginning to lose his balance, and he managed to dismount safely as Tumbleweed trotted toward the exit gate. "Son of a bitch!" Roberto shouted, vaulting over the arena fence to congratulate his friend. "You rode him. You actually rode him." Eduardo was shaking his head in amazement. "Nick, I've been around this sport for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone adapt to left-handed riding that quickly. You've got natural talent that doesn't depend on which hand you use." The celebration was brief but meaningful. Nick had proven to himself that left-handed riding was not only possible, but potentially successful. He wasn't ready for professional competition yet, but he was ready for the next level of preparation. Over the following weeks, Nick developed a routine that balanced his work at the auto shop with his riding practice. He would work mornings at Varela Auto Repair, helping his father with the growing business while learning the administrative side of the operation. Afternoons were spent at the Calderon Ranch, working with increasingly challenging bulls and refining his left-handed technique. The arrangement suited everyone involved. Miguel was proud to see his son pursuing his passion while still contributing to the family business. Maria appreciated Nick's newfound sense of purpose and direction. And Nick himself felt for the first time since the accident that he was building something rather than just recovering from something. The real test came in late June when Roberto suggested that Nick enter a small professional rodeo in Roswell, New Mexico. The competition wouldn't include top-ranked riders, but it would be Nick's first official ride since the accident, his first opportunity to compete for prize money and points toward a professional ranking. "Are you sure I'm ready?" Nick asked as they discussed the possibility over dinner at L&J Cafe, a local institution known for its green chili and its walls covered with photographs of El Paso's rodeo history. "I think you're as ready as you're going to be without actual competition experience," Roberto replied. "And the bulls in Roswell won't be as difficult as what you'll face if you make it back to the PBR level." "If I make it back?" Roberto grinned. "When you make it back. I've seen your progress, Hermano. You're riding better now than some guys who've never been injured." The entry deadline for the Roswell Rodeo was the following day. Nick spent that evening walking through his neighborhood, past the small houses with carefully maintained yards and pickup trucks parked in driveways, past the corner grocery stores and auto parts shops that formed the economic backbone of East El Paso. This was his world, the place that had shaped him, and he realized that returning to professional bull riding didn't mean abandoning it. When he called the rodeo secretary the next morning to enter the bull riding competition, Nick's hands were steady and his voice was calm. He was no longer the same rider who had been thrown by Devil's Hook 8 months earlier, but he was ready to find out who he could become. The drive to Roswell took 3 hours through desert landscape that gradually gave way to ranch country dotted with oil derricks and cattle. Maria rode with Nick and Roberto, having arranged to take Friday off from her new job teaching summer school in El Paso. The normalcy of the trip, friends traveling together to a rodeo, talking about everything and nothing, felt like a gift Nick had never expected to receive again. The Roswell Rodeo was held at the local fairgrounds, a modest facility that couldn't compare to the professional arenas Nick had known during his PBR career. But the atmosphere was familiar and comforting. The smell of barbecue and funnel cakes, the sound of country music from the concession stands, and the nervous energy of cowboys preparing for competition. Nick drew a bull named Prairie Fire for his first ride back. The animal was known for consistent, athletic bucking without the extreme difficulty of PBR-level stock. As Nick prepared his equipment behind the chutes, he felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that preceded every ride, but without the crushing pressure he'd felt during his professional career. "Remember," Roberto advised as Nick wrapped his bull rope around his left hand, "this isn't about proving anything to anyone else. This is about proving to yourself that you can still do this. And if I can't, then you'll know that too, and you can make decisions based on reality instead of fear." Nick settled onto Prairie Fire's back, his left-handed grip feeling natural for the first time since he'd started relearning the sport. The bull was smaller than Devil's Hook, but more athletic than the practice animals he'd been riding, and Nick could feel the coiled energy beneath him. "You ready?" asked the gate man. Nick nodded, took a deep breath, and prepared to find out who he'd become. The gate opened, and Prairie Fire launched out of the chute with a spinning jump that immediately tested Nick's new technique. But instead of fighting the bull's rotation, Nick moved with it, his body flowing with the animal's rhythm in a way that felt both foreign and completely natural. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Prairie Fire switched directions, trying to catch Nick off balance, but the left-handed rider anticipated the move and adjusted his position smoothly. The crowd began to cheer, sensing they were watching something special. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. Nick realized with growing amazement that he wasn't just staying on the bull. He was riding him well, with a style and fluidity that he'd never achieved as a right-handed rider. The limitation had become a liberation, forcing him to develop a more sophisticated approach to the sport. 6 seconds. 7 seconds. Prairie Fire gathered himself for one final effort, a high-kicking sequence designed to jar loose any rider who had survived the earlier challenges. Nick stayed centered, his left hand maintaining its grip while his right arm provided perfect counterbalance. 8 seconds. The horn sounded, and Nick dismounted cleanly as Prairie Fire trotted toward the exit gate. The crowd was on its feet, recognizing that they had witnessed not just a successful ride, but the emergence of a new and distinctly talented left-handed bull rider. Roberto was the first to reach Nick in the arena, followed closely by Maria, who had vaulted over the fence despite strict rules about spectators in the competition area. Their embrace was fierce and emotional, a celebration not just of 8 seconds on a bull, but of the long journey that had brought Nick back to this moment. "How did it feel?" Maria asked, tears streaming down her face. "It felt like coming home," Nick replied, "but to a different house than the one I used to live in." When the scores were announced 20 minutes later, Nick's 84-point ride had won the bull riding competition and earned him his first prize money in 8 months. More importantly, it had earned him something that couldn't be measured in points or dollars: the knowledge that his career wasn't over but transformed. As they drove back to El Paso that evening, Nick's championship buckle on the dashboard reflecting the setting sun, Roberto asked the question that would determine the next phase of Nick's life. "So what now, Hermano? Do you want to try to qualify for the PBR again?" Nick considered the question as the familiar skyline of El Paso appeared in the distance, the Franklin Mountains silhouetted against a sky painted in shades of orange and purple. He thought about the auto shop where his father was building something meaningful from honest work, about Maria's classroom where she was shaping young minds, about the community that had supported him through the darkest period of his life. "I want to keep riding," Nick said finally. "But I don't want to spend 8 months a year on the road anymore. I want to build something here in El Paso, something that combines riding with the life I've discovered I actually want to live." "What does that look like?" "I don't know yet. Maybe I compete regionally and help run the family business. Maybe I start a riding school for kids who want to learn the sport. Maybe I do something no one's thought of yet." Roberto smiled, understanding his friend's decision completely. "That sounds like the perfect plan for someone who's learned that the best life isn't the one you planned, but the one you build from the pieces you have left." 6 months later, Nick Varela stood in the arena at the El Paso County Coliseum, the same facility where Devil's Hook had ended his first career 8 seconds. But instead of preparing to ride, he was teaching a group of teenage students the fundamentals of bull riding, emphasizing safety, respect for the animals, and the mental discipline required to succeed in the sport. Varela Auto Repair had expanded to include a second location, with Nick handling the business management while his father focused on the technical work he loved. The shop sponsored several local riders and had become a gathering place for the regional rodeo community. Most importantly, Nick had found a way to remain connected to bull riding without sacrificing the relationships and community that gave his life meaning. He competed occasionally at regional events, always riding left-handed and often winning, but his identity was no longer dependent on 8-second rides or championship rankings. As he watched his students practice their technique on a mechanical bull he'd installed in the shop's back lot, Nick reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The accident with Devil's Hook had taken away the life he'd planned, but it had given him the opportunity to build a life he'd never imagined. One that was richer, more connected to community, and more sustainable than anything he could have achieved as a full-time professional rider. "Coach Nick," called out one of his students, a 16-year-old girl named Sophia who reminded him of his sister Carmen. "Can you show us that left-handed grip one more time?" Nick smiled and walked over to demonstrate the technique that had saved his career and transformed his understanding of what it meant to be successful. As he wrapped the practice rope around his left hand, showing Sophia and the other students the subtle adjustments that made left-handed riding possible, he realized that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering your challenges, but from learning to dance with them. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Franklin Mountains, painting the desert sky in the familiar shades of orange and purple that had welcomed him home from Roswell 8 months earlier. In a few hours, Nick would close the shop, have dinner with Maria at their favorite restaurant, and spend the evening planning their wedding, which was scheduled for the following spring. It wasn't the life he'd planned at 28 when he'd climbed onto Devil's Hook's back for what he'd thought would be just another ride in a long professional career. But it was a life built from courage, adaptability, and the willingness to discover that sometimes being thrown from your planned path is the only way to find your true destination. As Nick helped his students load their equipment into their parents' trucks, he caught sight of his championship buckle from Roswell hanging on the office wall next to photographs of his father's first customers and his sister's graduation from automotive technology school. The buckle represented not just a successful ride, but a successful transformation. Proof that resilience isn't about returning to who you used to be, but about discovering who you're capable of becoming. The last student drove away as the streetlights began to flicker on along Alameda Avenue, and Nick locked up the shop that had become so much more than he'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to build something meaningful from the intersection of passion and purpose. But tonight, Nick Varela, former professional bull rider, current business owner, future husband, and always a man who'd learned that being thrown down was only the beginning of getting back up, was exactly where he belonged.